but are you sure enough of those projections to cover all of your proposals? And didn't many of these kinds of programs cause the deficit situation to begin with?
Well, Bob, if you look at where we are on the surplus now, I'm very proud that we have a surplus instead of a deficit after, 7.5 years of good economic leadership in our country. And I would like to make sure that we pay down the national debt, that we secure Social Security, we add a prescription drug benefit to Medicare, we provide affordable tax cuts, like making it possible for people to deduct the cost of college tuition, giving families that are caring for their relatives with disabilities or Alzheimer's a long-term care tax credit, and make investments in education, the environment, and health care. I have been very careful to cost out my plan because I believe in a balanced budget. I'm a New Democrat who supports a balanced budget, and I also know that you're right. Those surpluses are projected. They're not in hand. They're not in the bank. That's why I reject the large tax cut that independent experts have said is more than $1 trillion that my opponent has proposed, along with the privatization idea of Social Security. In fact, the Fiscal Policy Institute said today that if you add up everything that my opponent has proposed, he's spent the entire surplus. I don't think that's a very prudent course for our country. I reject that. So I would want to be sure that we were carefully paying down the debt and taking care of our primary responsibilities before I funded anything else.
Mr. Lazio.
Let me say, it's beyond shameless, I guess. I guess the tactic of naming a bunch of things and knowing that I don't have enough time to answer them is just positively Clinton-esque. But first of all, let me try and address a few things. Newt Gingrich is not running. If you had a record, I suppose, you wouldn't need to use Newt Gingrich. I'm running, and I have a strong New York record, number one. Number two, I have a tax plan that is focused on New York. You may be opposed to it because you believe that people should be taxed on income that they've already been taxed on. Maybe you believe that Social Security recipients making as little as $34,000 are rich. Maybe you believe that in Arkansas, but in New York, let me tell you, people making $34,000 a year are working because they have to work, not because they want to work. And lastly, you should be the last one talking about spending all the surplus because the National Taxpayers Union has said that you have completely wiped out all the surplus with all the things that Bob just mentioned.
Question for Mr. Lazio from Scott Levin.
Mr. Lazio, just a few miles from the studio is Love Canal. It's an area, of course, made infamous for toxic dumping. Last week, there was a brand new USA Today investigation, and it revealed 25 more sites in the state of New York and 13 right here in western New York that may have exposed government workers unknowingly to dangerous levels of radiation and toxic materials. Mr. Lazio, what do you propose should be done for these workers and for the communities around here where toxic sites are still a danger?
First of all, I, as a strong environmentalist, as somebody who has received the past endorsement, as a matter of fact, got their highest ranking, the League of Conservation Voters, the umbrella group for all environmental groups, as somebody who has written legislation to address acid rain in the Adirondacks and the cleanup of Long Island Sound, not just talked about it, but actually got the bill passed. As somebody who cares about the watershed, and as somebody who cares about this issue, I believe it's incredibly important for us to reauthorize Superfund legislation, to make sure that we have the resources that are necessary to clean up some of these sites. Now, the administration, they've been dragging their feet. They don't really want to agree to a Superfund bill. They don't want to agree to a brownfields bill. And my opponent, well, she's been missing in action. On the environment, her record is just thin air.
Mrs. Clinton.
Well, I'm very proud to have the endorsement of the Sierra Club, both here in New York and nationally, as well as the endorsement of Bobby Kennedy, Jr. And I believe that I received those endorsements both because I have worked on behalf of children's health and the environment. I've stood for clean air and worked in the administration to deal with problems from asthma to trying to figure out the possible environmental causes and correlations with breast cancer. But my opponent, on the other hand, stood against funding the EPA to the extent that was needed to do the job that's required, was in the forefront of so-called regulatory reform, which would have gutted our environmental bills. And, you know, he talks about how he shouldn't be associated with Newt Gingrich. The fact is there was a critical moment when he was with Newt Gingrich, and I believe that was against the interests of New York.
We have asked members of our audience and voters all across the state to email us questions. The first question is from Frank Messiah, who's the president of the NAACP Buffalo chapter here. Do you support or oppose strengthening existing public school systems rather than going to publicly funded school vouchers for private schools? And Keith Fromm adds to that, for Mrs. Clinton, you had the opportunity to send your daughter to a very good school. Should other families have that same opportunity who don't have the same means? Mrs. Clinton.
Well, are they here in the audience, Tim?
Yes, they are.
I'd love to just have them maybe raise a hand so I can see who's asking the question. Thank you. I have a plan for education that builds on what needs to be done in the public school system. You know, I've now visited schools throughout the state, and some of them are among the finest in the world that you could find anywhere. But others are overcrowded, under-resourced, don't have the certified, qualified teaching staff that they need, and we're not doing the job that's required to give our children the kind of education that the 21st century demands. That's why I've put forth a plan that I and the Senate would do to try to get the teachers that we need, to recruit and train them, and to provide the funds that are required for modernizing our schools, as well as setting high standards, making them safe from violence, doing what is needed to give our children the kind of warm and supportive atmosphere that every young child needs. Now, I do not support vouchers. And the reason I don't is because I don't think we can afford to siphon dollars away from our underfunded public schools. You know, when we go into a school that I do all the time that's built for 1,000, as I was in Queens not so long ago, where there are twice as many children, that's work for the public school system to be done. I was at the Black Rock Academy here in Buffalo a few months ago. A wonderful old school, but it's so old they can't figure out how to wire it for computers, so those children don't have access to what's needed. I'd like us to do what we know works: smaller class size, disciplined, qualified teachers, high standards. Let's do what we know works and not give up on public education.
Mr. Lazio?
Sure. I unveiled a strong education plan to address the needs of New York. I said that we should begin to test teachers, but we should also try to attract and retain the very best. That we should offer scholarships to teachers, to students who finish in the top 10% of their class with a need to go into science and math. I've said that we should help provide more scholarships for our young people, because I know how difficult it is to afford to pay to go to college. But I also believe that it's immoral to ask a child to go to a school where they can't learn or where they're not safe. You know, Vice President Al Gore recently said, if I was in one of those failing school districts and I was a poor parent, I'd want to have some help too. I'd want a voucher too. So if Al Gore believes that, and according to the Hunter College poll that just came out, 80% of African American and Hispanic parents feel that they need it, why should we trap poor kids in failing schools simply because the teachers' unions won't agree with it?
Would you take money from public schools in order to do that?
Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, in my education plan, I create a new funding stream for what I call opportunity scholarships. I reserve the vast amount of money for public schools. I'm a public school graduate. My two little girls are going to second and third grade in New York public schools. Our first responsibility is the public school system. But we need to address the over 100 failing schools in New York.
The next question is from Patricia Crawley, who is here tonight. As a Western New Yorker, she's very concerned that tax dollars are currently being distributed to New York City disproportionately, and wants Western New York to receive an equitable and fair amount of money. How do you respond?
Well, the real problem really is not that New York City gets more than it deserves. It's that New York doesn't get enough as a state. When we send $15 billion a year more to Washington in our tax dollars than we get back, something is desperately wrong. And I'll tell you what's desperately wrong. It is that under this administration, it's at its worst point ever. And what has my opponent done about it? Absolutely nothing. When it came to funding veterans' health, the formula changed so that money shifted from New York to down south. I had to step in to stop it. When the president exercised the loan time, he exercised his veto to hurt New York Medicaid program. What did my opponent do? She did absolutely nothing. I've been there for New York. I believe we should be there to make sure that New York gets its fair share. But we should begin by making sure that we send fewer dollars to Washington and keep more of our tax dollars here in our own backyard to build stronger families, more modern businesses, and better jobs.
People from Western New York believe, Congressman, that if you're from Long Island or you're from New York City, you're going to forget about Buffalo and Western New York after you're elected.
See, I've been up here about 6 or 7 times. They're going to see me so much over the next 6 years, they'll probably get sick of me. Let me tell you, I am a New Yorker. I'm fiercely loyal to my state. My friends and my family are all here. They've been here all of their life.